The Stoics, Epictetus included in particular, had what we would call a fully developed theory of human nature. Sometimes we call this a philosophical anthropology. They also had what we would call a philosophy of action. And philosophy of action is dealing with issues such as the relationship between freedom and determinism, how it is that we're actually able to choose to do things, make ourselves do things, how it is that human beings are connected with the world. Are our actions, are our choices caused by things outside of our control, or do they lie within our control? These are all the sorts of things that Epictetus is deeply concerned with. And one of the things you're going to see him talking about over and over and over again in this work is what he's calling the ruling faculty, or sometimes called the rational faculty. He also talks about our faculty of choice. Sometimes he uses the words moral purpose in the translation. As I've mentioned before, faculty of choice and moral purpose both translate the Greek prohairesis, and I'll talk a little bit about what that term means in a moment. And oftentimes we think of this as the will. When we talk about a person as having free will, what we typically mean is that that person is able to determine themselves. That is, they are able to make choices between different alternatives freely. They're also able to take a sort of reflexive position upon their own choices. If it's possible for you to think that your choices were wrong, or to choose not to make the same choice again, or to make a good choice and then to say, I need to keep making this choice over and over again until it becomes a habit through perseveringly willing that choice, that is a kind of freedom. So for Epictetus, all of these are really coming down to the same thing. They're different ways of looking at the same basic phenomenon or idea. We're going to look at the text in just a moment. I do want to talk a little bit about this notion of prohairesis. Now, that this Greek word prohairesis can be translated as preference as well, without deforming it too much. And if you think about what happens when you prefer one thing to another, or you prioritize, this is another way of thinking about it. When you prioritize, you say this matters more and this matters less. And how do you know that that's actually the case? Well, if you can't have both of them and you have to sacrifice one of them, the one that's actually more valuable is the priority and the other one has a lower priority. Or the top one is your highest preference and the other one is your lower preference. Now, if you think about what you're doing when you're making decisions, when you're choosing how to respond to things, when you're deciding about what you're going to do with the resources that you have at your capacity, which include your ability to think, your ability to choose, a lot of that can be understood in terms of preference. Because think about thinking for a moment. Now, when I say that to you right now, hopefully you are indeed thinking about thinking. But you might also be thinking about, when is he going to get to the point? How long is this video? I've got, something boiling on the stove, there's noise outside. You could be thinking about a lot of different things. If you're allowing yourself to be distracted, that's in a certain way kind of a choice, isn't it? And Epictetus would be willing to say, that's a preference. Now, you can understand preference as what you do in an individual circumstance within a particular situation. And you can understand it in the more global sense as pervading your whole narrative, or at least a portion of the narrative of your life, your relationships with other people, how it is that you characteristically engage with the rest of the world, or reflect upon yourself. See, we can understand this as not just being some sort of tool or, capacity that we have, but as really being the fabric of who we are. What's really interesting about it is that this is something that we can develop further along, bit by bit by bit. We can also make it worse over time. If we make the wrong choices, and we do that over the course of our life, by the time that we get to the end of our life, we may regret the kind of people that we've turned out to be, but we're not going to be able to change it. So, you notice I've got this arrow here, this reflexivity. That's our capacity to actually change ourselves. And that's a freedom. It's a little bit different than the freedom to, pick Coke or Pepsi or RC or not to drink Coke at all. The freedom to think about, what kind of person do I want to be? How do I want to mold this thing that I am, that I barely understand, into something that is going to be happier, or is going to be in less conflict with other people, or is not going to be so anxious, or will, have some idea about what I'm supposed to be doing here. What is the point of human life? That's a higher degree of freedom. And for Epictetus, it takes place within what we call determinism, where things determine each other. We are, you might say, this is an Aristotelian term, not a Stoic term, self-moving things. We make choices about what we're going to do with what we are. And those form who we are over time. Let's look at the text. There's going to be a couple main ideas that will come up. You notice I've got some other stuff on the board. I don't have everything written on the board because I don't want to super clutter it, everything that we'll talk about, but I'll note those in turn. So, again, if we begin the discourses where they start, chapter 1 is titled "Of the Things Which Are in Our Power and Not in Our Power." But he doesn't begin by talking about those. He begins by talking about faculties. And what is a faculty? A faculty is a sort of nexus of ability, you can call it, within you. So if you think about your senses, for example, your sense of sight, it's not something that changes from moment to moment insofar as it's the sense. The things that you're seeing change from moment to moment as you're scanning around the room. But that faculty of sight that resides in your eyeballs, and I suppose in the optic nerve and your mental processing in your brain and all those sorts of things, that remains the same over time. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to recognize what you're seeing, would you? And we have other faculties as well. We can talk about my faculty of locomotion, going back and forth in place, right? I have these amazing tools that can do anything with all sorts of other tools. Aristotle called the hand the tool of tools. And the Stoics would agree with that. It's that which we grasp with. You notice that a lot of their conceptual terminology is actually taken from hand language. So we have faculties. Some of them are faculties for, let's say, digestion or respiration, and we need those. But most important are the faculties that compose what we would call our mind, or our soul, or our personality. So he says, of all these faculties, you'll not find one which is capable of contemplating itself. Why does that matter? So what if sight can't see itself? So what if digestion can't, think about whether it's digesting well or anything like that? He gives a few other examples. The grammatic art, the art of speaking a language. Now, you can use language to talk about language. As a matter of fact, a grammar is a linguistic tool that reflects upon the language that it's about. But the faculty of grammar, the language processing parts of your brain, if you want to think about it that way, are not reflexive in the same way that what he's talking about here is. Music. Music can judge about melody. It can judge whether certain things are harmonious or discordant. It can, music theory has developed quite a bit. It can tell you, if you want to produce this kind of psychological effect, play this kind of music. But music can't reflect upon itself. So insofar as we have some faculty developed, we're not using that to reflect upon the nature of human being. We're just reflecting on the object that we're dealing with. So he says, does either of these contemplate itself? By no means. But when you must write something to your friend, grammar will tell you what words to use. If you want to actually communicate with other people, it's awfully handy to have the linguistic faculty, isn't it? And if you want to play with music, that's awfully handy for it as well. If you don't develop the skill that you need, for instance, I used to play the bass guitar, And if you handed it to me right now, I probably wouldn't be very good at it because I haven't played one for over 15 years. I do have a banjo, and I can play some things on that, not at a great level of facility, but to some degree. And that's because I developed that. But that doesn't reflect upon itself the way the ruling faculty does. So he says, whether you should sing at the present time and play on the lute or do neither, music won't tell you that. Whether you should be looking at this thing or eating this thing, your senses won't actually tell you that. Whether you should say this or that, grammar will tell you, well, if you want to communicate in this way, this is what you should say. But grammar won't actually tell you it would be good for you to do that. That's up to some other part of ourselves that has to think about what's really good or bad, appropriate, inappropriate, where our duties lie, where we have a lot of freedom or latitude to do one thing or another. That's not up to those faculties. So he goes on and he says, which faculty will tell you about that? Well, it's the rational faculty, the ruling part. In Stoic anthropology, we have parts to ourselves, and how you want to understand those parts, it all depends on how you want to parse it out. But it's not like, say, for example, Plato with his 3 parts of the soul, one part being the rational part, and then there being this thumatic part, and then the appetites. Instead, it's really the rational part and pretty much everything else. Another thing to keep in mind as well is that the Stoics, when it comes down to it, are actually materialists. So they don't think that soul is something totally independent of body. They think that soul is something that comes out of a particular configuration of the body, or perhaps it's composed of certain bodily elements that aren't visible but can be understood. So if you want to think of this as part of our brain, Epictetus really wouldn't have a fundamental problem with you doing that today. There's a capacity that we have for figuring out what we ought to do with other things. The senses, for example, our bodily parts, for deciding whether things are good for us or bad for us. We're also able to take a position like that on our thoughts and opinions, on our emotions, our desires, and aversions. And we'll get to that in just a moment. I really want to stress this reflexivity, though. He says, the rational faculty is the only faculty we have received which examines itself, which looks at what it is. It's only reason that can tell us what reason is, whether it's working right, how it should be trained, what it takes to develop it. He says, what power it has, what is the value of its gift, and it examines all the other faculties. It is this faculty which is also capable, and he brings up another term here, of judging of appearances, things that are coming to us from the outside. Whenever we're doing that, we're getting something, say, through our senses, but then we have to process it. We have to figure out, well, what's going on? How should I interpret that information that's coming to me? That's part of why when we watch TV, or, nowadays, most of us watch it on our computers or our phones or tablets, we don't see an image of somebody, say, shooting a gun at us and immediately run out of the room, because our senses are telling us, hey, there's a gunfight going on, and I suppose our native instinct for self-preservation would probably say, you better get down. But our ruling faculty says, no, don't worry about that. We're watching that for entertainment right now, or it's just background, or that's not a real thing. That's what our capacity for thinking allows us. So let's go on and look at a few other sections as well, where he's saying some very important things. Let's look at section 2, chapter 2 of the first book. He talks about the rational and the irrational. Now, we've talked about the rational part, but the rational part can get screwed up. it can go astray. If it does that, it's doing things in an irrational manner, right? When we say that somebody's being irrational, we mean that they're going against reason. Now, this brings up a really interesting point. If everybody has this rational part, how are people able to be irrational? Does it mean that that part just like goes out of commission? Like, for example, when I go into a rage, I'm angry, I see red, whatever that means. I've never actually seen red, blood before my eyes or something like that. But I know what it's like to be angry and to say stupid things that you regret later on because you're so overcome by that emotion that it feels like the emotion turns off the part of your brain that would be counseling you and saying, wait a second, you like this person. If you say those sorts of things to them, you're going to damage your relationship, perhaps, irrevocably, because, man, if somebody was going to say that sort of stuff to me, I sure wouldn't forgive them. I wouldn't want to do anything with them after that. Anger feels like it does that sometimes, doesn't it? At least for some of us. But Epictetus would say, no. You know what's really going on there? That's not something that's totally separate from this rational part. The person is thinking when they're angry. For the Stoics, emotions, desires, aversions, they correspond to thoughts, to opinions, to judgments about things. When I get angry, the Stoics would say, what I'm actually thinking is I have been wronged, and I've been wronged by that person over there, and that's one complex of thoughts, and along with that goes a feeling, right? And then the other complex of thoughts that goes along with it is, I shouldn't take that. I should get revenge on them. I should make them suffer in return like I'm feeling pain right now. That's another set of thoughts, but along with it is going a desire. I want them to feel hurt, some aversion. I don't want to have anything to do with them. Some other emotions. It may grieve me that I'm hurting them in the process, but at the same time I'm taking a sort of delight in it. Homer says anger is sweeter than honey, and the ancient Greeks seem to think that was a pretty apt description. Well, all of that actually affects our ruling part, our rational part. The person who's allowing themselves to be angry, or the person who is greedy, for example, and is able to tell themselves over and over again, what I'm doing really isn't that bad. I'm not really harming myself, and I'm just taking stuff from other people, and they probably had it coming to them anyway. If they don't want me to take advantage of them, well, they should just be smarter. These are thoughts. These are not just random individual thoughts. These are thought processes that become part of the fabric of who a person is. So Epictetus will tell us in another chapter later on in the work, the ruling faculty, the rational faculty of a bad person is not to be trusted, because what they've done is they've damaged it. It's sort of like, imagine if you had a computer and you downloaded all sorts of stuff indiscriminately from the internet onto it. Even if you have a Mac, you're going to get some malware. And what is that malware going to do? Some of the malware is going to let people snoop on what you're typing and maybe steal your credit card. Not good. Other malware might be, crashing your system or using your system to replicate stuff that it's sending out to other people. It gets into your email file. You've probably all had some relative who's not careful with what they click on and sent you something that had a virus at one time or another, or some other kind of malware. And some malware is so sophisticated that what it does is it pops up and it says, you have malware on your system. We've detected it. Click here for a full scan. And then you click there. And there actually wasn't anything on your system, but you click there and now all the other stuff comes in. You could think of what's going on in the cases of people who don't take care of their ruling faculty and allow it to be determined by appearances, by things that are outside of our control, as downloading a bunch of malware. It makes you vulnerable to manipulation, to coercion. In Epictetus' case, he would say, it makes you vulnerable to sadness, to trouble, to being affected by things that are coming from outside of your control, things that other people or natural events or fate has control over, but you don't. So, going back to this issue of the rational and the irrational, he says the rational and the irrational appear such in a different way to different persons, just as the good and the bad, the profitable and the unprofitable. For this reason, we need discipline. We need some training in order to learn how to adapt our preconception. I should put that term here. This is something that we have. We've talked about this. These preconceptions, these general ideas, how do we adapt these to external things, to appearances? How do we adapt our notion of good, which is rather vague, to the things that we're encountering, so we don't screw it up and think that bad things are actually good? A properly functioning, rational, ruling part is going to make those kinds of decisions well, because it has some sort of guide, some sort of rule. So he says, in order to determine the rational and the irrational, we use not only the external things, but we also consider what's appropriate to each person. Here he has a very funny example of somebody who, has to hold a chamber pot for another person. A chamber pot is literally a pot to piss in. It's, the toilets before toilets existed. And, so holding a chamber pot is a pretty low thing to do. And a lot of people would say, that's not for me, you keep your money, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to find another job. And bedpan would be like an example of a chamber pot, right? That would be the modern equivalent. So he says, some people will say that it's consistent with reason to hold a chamber pot for another, and to look to this only, that if he doesn't hold it, he's going to receive stripes, meaning he's going to get whipped, and will not receive his food. But if he shall hold the pot, he won't suffer anything hard or disagreeable. To another person, not only does the holding of a chamber pot appear intolerable, but it's also intolerable for him to allow another to do this office for him. And Epictetus says, so if you ask me, should you hold the chamber pot or not, I got to say, that's up to you. And when I say it's up to you, I don't mean just go with your gut or anything like that. You seriously need to think about where your priorities lie. The priorities that you've established for yourself. Because those are going to determine how you take in and interpret information and how you make choices about these things in the world that we have to engage in, including other people, including their demands upon us, including what they offer to us. So if your rational faculty is well ordered, you're going to be a rational person. If your rational faculty is disordered, even though you have a rational faculty, it's going to generate irrationality. And that's going to trickle down into your thoughts and your opinions and your emotions. You may let your emotions run the show, which for a Stoic is a very bad idea. Your desires and aversions are going to be skewed to all sorts of things that you don't have any control over. And if you do that, as he says, what does desire want? To enjoy the good that it desires. Desire means seeing something as a good. And if I see something as a good, I naturally want to extend towards it. Aversion is a function of seeing something as a bad thing. There's a thought that goes along with it, an opinion. That's a bad thing. I want to avoid it. If you desire things that you don't have any control over, or very little control, you're probably going to be unhappy, because the external world is not set up to make you happy. It's set up to do what it does. Same thing if you are averse to things that are beyond your control, you're going to be unhappy. He has the example, for example. See, I wish I hadn't said that. I've got an aversion to saying stupid things. But apparently I have very, very little control over that. He has this example of going to the baths. And the Greeks had public baths. And it's sort of like going to the public swimming pool. If you've ever gone to the public swimming pool, it's kind of fun, but it's not really a treat, because it'd be great if it wasn't for all the other people that are there. And some of them are fun, but there's always going to be some guy who's playing his music too loud, or somebody who's like eating some really stinky food, or somebody who's shouting at their children. There's going to be some children running around and engaging in all sorts of craziness. Somebody will probably come near to drowning. You can just run through all sorts of things. That's not to mention what people actually do in the pool. I don't need to talk about that. Now, if you are averse to that sort of thing, you probably shouldn't choose to go to the public pool, right? Is what the ruling faculty would tell us. Because those sort of things, whether the public pool experience is the way that you imagine it, really lies outside of your control. And that is our choice, whether we steer our desires and our aversions in certain ways. We have some choice about modifying those, modifying our mindset, changing over time the kind of viewpoint that we have, and becoming thereby more rational. Let's look at another section. This is from Book 2, Chapter 17, one we've looked at already. How we must adapt preconceptions to particular cases. And he says, who among us does not speak of good and bad, useful and not useful? For who among us has not a preconception of these things? Is it then a distinct and perfect preconception? Probably not. So one of the things that we want to do, if we want this ruling faculty to be in good shape, if we want it to genuinely be free and not being determined by all this other stuff over here, so we want to find some sort of discipline or rule which will allow us to adapt these things properly. And he says, if you properly adapt your preconceptions, you're not going to be unhappy, you're not going to be hindered. Yeah, that's what I wanted to get from that one. Now, he's got another discussion in Book 3, Chapter 3. He says that the material for the wise and the good person is our ruling faculty. That's what we should be most concerned with. Now, that's not the case for most of us. Most of us are actually using our ruling faculty not to look at itself. I'm going to erase the reflexivity here, but instead to sort of look at all the other things outside of our control, including our own body, which isn't really fully in our control, but definitely external things like property and possessions, other people. And instead of sort of withdrawing our desires and aversions from those things and occupying ourselves with getting ourselves on track, with actually developing this part of ourselves out of the morass that it's typically in, we scatter and distract ourselves with all of these things over here, which then make us worse over here. You could think of this as sort of like developing a muscle, the ability to look at yourself, to come to good judgments about your own faculty, to stick to resolutions that you make, for example. That's something that requires dedication, that requires some practice. So he says, the good person, the person who's going to live a good life, has to occupy themselves mostly over here. The body is the material for the physician or the trainer. That doesn't mean that you don't care about your body, you don't try to be healthy. We've already talked about that, right? But the body is not really what you are so much. And you don't have so much control over it. Land is a matter for the husbandman or the farmer. If you actually have land, let it out to your farmer. Don't think about it. Let them have the worries. Let those other people, concern their ruling parts with making sure that your land is tilled well. And you could say the same thing about other things. It doesn't have to be land. It could be your car. Now, if you like, doing your own work on your car, go ahead. Otherwise, leave it to the mechanic. And don't worry about it, because that's outside of your control. You do have a choice whether you go to a mechanic who screws you over or not, or a mechanic who's got a good reputation, that who's not going to screw you over. But what the mechanic does, that's their business. That's within their power, not within your power. So he says a few things here following this up that are really important to think about. And this is a good way to close this off. He says, the business of the wise and good man is to use appearances these things in the world in conformity with nature. What does that mean? So this whole idea of harmony or conformity with nature means living a fully human life, a life that is fully rational, where these things are not determining us, but we are actually determining ourselves, which is going to give us freedom. Otherwise, we're just caught up in this web of determinism. Now, he goes on and he says some other things that are really good for putting this in perspective. He says, as the money changer is not allowed to reject Caesar's coin, nor the seller of herbs, but if you show the coin, whether he chooses or not, he must give up what is sold for the coin, so it is in the matter of the soul. When the good appears, it immediately attracts to itself. The evil repels from itself. But the soul will never reject the manifest appearance of the good, any more than persons will reject Caesar's coin. So, what does that mean? That means that we need to pay attention to what really is good. We need to make sure that we've got our basic ideas, our fundamental concepts worked out right, so that they're not going to lead us astray and damage our ruling faculty and make us more irrational. Because the ruling faculty, when it comes down to us, is really going to be a bunch of thoughts and opinions and choices that we make. You know, what he's saying here, to talk about the determinism part, is that if we've actually, recognized something as good, even if we've misrecognized it, that's going to compel us to seek it. Now, we can see something as good, and we can have that little voice saying, no, it's not really good for you, and we have a choice whether to listen to it or whether to go along with our first impulse, because we do have a capacity to self-determine here. But once we've actually decided which way we're going to go that way or this way. So we need to be very careful about what we actually give our assent to, what we actually say is true or what we say is false, what we think is good, what we think is bad. And for Epictetus, good and bad lie over here. They don't lie out there in the things of the world, except insofar as our use, and that's a matter of our choices, our use of them is good or bad, but the things themselves are neither good nor bad. So we want to form proper understandings of those. And here's what I'm going to close with. Forming those proper understandings is not just a matter of, being rational, taking in information, thinking about things. It's also got this function of choosing to it. You can have information and not use it, and then the information isn't any good to you, is it? You may as well not have the information. So what actually is the evidence that somebody truly is rational? They're making the right kind of choices, and that contributes to, or at least maintains, their rationality.